Yes, VFX world. Welcome to episode 3 of the VFX Script Podcast with Motors VFX. We're out in LA for this episode, and I'm super stoked to introduce this guest. He started an indie film, went into visual effects production, and then has almost had 2 decades studio side with the likes of Warner Brothers, Universal, and most recently Netflix. Chris Cram, how you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you, Kurt. Welcome to Los Angeles.
Thank you, man. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
No, this is awesome. You know, it's something I've been looking forward to since you said yes. And having someone from the studio side for the VFX community to listen to, I think is going to be super insightful and an awesome experience. But, you know, I mean, before we get into that, you know, coming into visual effects, what was that thought process? Sort of back in New Jersey, and then wanting to take that plunge.
I've wanted to work in films for as long as I can remember. I remember seeing behind the scenes stuff about movies and thinking, I want to do that. I want to do something with that. I would make little video projects and stuff in school. But I was in New Jersey, and it's pretty far from Hollywood, obviously, about as far as you could get. Well, maybe not as far as you could get these days, but at the time, pretty far. But when I was in college at Rutgers, there was an opportunity to be a PA on a movie with Kevin Smith and Scott Mosier, and that was Chasing Amy. So when I interviewed there, they only asked me 2 questions: if I had my own car and if I was willing to work for nothing. So I fit the qualifications. The UPM hired me. And the thing is, I was still in school, so I had to talk to my program, the film studies program, about finagling like a independent study credit out of it. So that's the way I was able to sort of do it while I was still in school. So I kind of started at 18 in indie film. And then I worked my way through a couple of years in indie films, especially in the New York area. I stayed with Kevin and Scott for a couple stuff. I worked on Dogma. And then I moved to Prague to teach English. Oh, nice. To be a Bohemian expat for a little bit. And while I was there, a movie came over, and a friend of mine called me and said, hey, I think there might be a role for a PA on this movie that's coming to shoot in Prague. And that was Van Helsing. And so when I met, it was a job in the visual effects department. I didn't really know what visual effects was, but I knew how to be a PA. And they were looking for a local hire at $400 a week, which was big money for me, living in Prague as a local. Like, that was enough to pay my rent and also buy rounds of drinks for everybody. So I got the gig, and it was in ILM. ILM was the visual effects vendor. So when I started working with them, and they could see that I knew my way around computers, they started training me on some equipment. So this person named John Wisnant, who was a longtime match mover at ILM, taught me how to use this thing called a Trimble, and I learned to be basically what we would now call like a data wrangler, but back then it was a match move assistant. Back then we didn't have as many like job categorizations in visual effects. You just kind of like, as a PA, you just did a lot of the stuff. Scott Squires and Ben Snow were the visual effects supervisors out of ILM, and they just kept giving me more and more to do. When the show was wrapping out of Prague and was going to come back to Los Angeles, the exec producer, the line producer said, we have this job for visual effects coordinator in LA. You could do the job. You could throw your stuff on the production plane and we'll move you. So this was back in the days where you could rent an apartment on Craigslist. I rented an apartment on Craigslist, flew to LA and slept my first night on the floor of an empty apartment. And I just continued working on that show. And then from there, kind of the rest is history. I met Jennifer Bell, who is a visual effects producer, and she's like my, professional soulmate, my partner in crime.
Love that.
We worked together on Jarhead. And then I went to work on a Night Shyamalan movie, all in visual effects. I was sort of working my way up through the visual effects production department. And then Jen called at some point and said, hey, would you like to come work at the studio with me at Universal? And that's when I went inside. So I spent about 15 years with Universal as a visual effects executive. And then Netflix called and said, would you like to come over and run the visual effects film department here? And here I am today.
Awesome. I mean, that's a pretty impressive breakdown, and covered some serious ground. I mean, in terms of those three establishments, were there similarities across the board? Were there differences in terms of the way visual effects was run? Obviously, streaming's becoming more popular. Was there any variables between the three?
Yeah, I mean, look, the visual effects industry's changed a ton since I started. I mean, my first job was in 2002-ish, 2003, somewhere around there. And in 21 years, look how much it's changed. I mean, when I was doing it, the DI was still kind of new, right? So we have a much higher volume of visual effects production than we did when I started. We also have a lot more consolidation in the visual effects companies than when I started. And I think, look, Jennifer Bell taught me everything I know about visual effects production. So to the extent, and I think she's probably the best in the business. So I think to the extent that anybody handles visual effects production at a studio level, it should be done the way Universal does it. There are similarities across studios. There are some differences. I think those are less meaningful to probably people downstream, like artists.
Yep.
I think it more is the relationship that those executives have with sort of the leadership at the vendors. Some executives have reputations for being really difficult or being tough on vendors, or priding themselves on getting the most out of a vendor.
Yeah.
I think that's not how we operate. I think we like to see it as a partnership and building a trusted network of companies and relationships that you can leverage, relationships that you develop over decades.
Sure.
So that there are going to be times where you need something from them, but there's also times where they need something from you. And I think that is the better way to go about handling the role of a visual effects executive at a major film studio, rather than just trying to grind vendors down for the best price and then leaving them in the dust and moving on. I don't think that's a sustainable model.
Fast forward to sort of May the 2nd, 2023, something that has ended up impacting, studios, vendors, and artists, the Hollywood strikes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, first off, how did you find it personally? And, secondly, how did that impact, you and sort of Netflix at the time?
Yeah, so I think, look, when you're working for a studio in a steady job, or especially in an executive capacity at a time, because this was my second strike that I've experienced. So when you're working in a role like that at a time of a strike, there's a little bit of almost survivor's guilt because you have a job.
Yes.
And the studios are unlikely to shed executive talent for what they see as a temporary thing, but it can be really difficult because you have a lot of friends, you have a lot of colleagues who are calling and saying, when's it going to end? When are we going to get work again? And that's extremely difficult because the answer is a lot of times we didn't know. I mean, unless you were participating with the labor team, and there would be times where the labor team would involve executives in, can we check this or that point? But most executives are not involved in the day-to-day negotiations. And so we truly don't know. Like we can give them a gut feel.
Yeah.
So that can be really hard because you want to help businesses that you care about and people that you care about. And there's not much information or help you can provide. So personally, that weighs you down. As a business, I hate to say it, but it was something of a gift for Netflix. I mean, Netflix had a lot of product in the pipeline.
Yep.
And they were public about this. I mean, and they were changing their strategy to have fewer things on the service. And so they had already stockpiled a bunch of stuff. So in some ways, the strike just gave them a pause in production. Did it disrupt a number of productions? Yes, including ones that I was directly working on. And those had to be navigated, and those challenges had to be navigated. But for the large part, Netflix was in a position to weather that strike, I think, better than most from a business standpoint, because they could just parcel out their stuff a little bit smoother and they were going to do it anyway. And so this just almost gave them a break in their cash flow.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So in hindsight, quite a smart move.
Well, no, I don't think Netflix chose the strike.
Sure, exactly.
I mean, I don't think they, alone, certainly, but I don't think they were as concerned from a business standpoint with a pause in production as, say, companies who need product for theatrical to fill slots.
No, for sure. I think, in that sense, just didn't know it was coming. But that thought process kind of, just kind of aligned quite well for them by the sound of things.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we're what, 18 months, maybe a little longer now down the line. It's been, I guess, a pretty rough ride across the board for various people. And I get asked the question constantly, when are things coming back? I mean, we're in November now. The reality is 2025 is almost here.
Mm-hmm.
From your perspective, how do you kind of see, from what you're hearing and feeling right now, 2025 playing out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know it's on a lot of people's minds, and we want to help answer it for them. I think it's important to clarify that since I've moved on from Netflix, and by the time this airs, I might be in a role in a different position. I just want to make sure that anything I express today are going to be views that are just my own, not representative of any possible future employer.
Cool. You're on record now.
I'm on record now. We're covered. But what I would say is this: the strike happened to coincide with a number of companies, I think, looking at their production strategies and saying, we might have too much product. And the strike allowed not just Netflix, but I think others to put a pause in and rethink how much product they were putting in the marketplace.
Okay.
So the idea of coming back, I think we have to look at that, because coming back to what? It's never going to be what it was prior to the strike, coming out of the pandemic. I mean, that was, we've heard it called peak TV. I don't think we can support, we know now that I don't think we can support that much product in the marketplace to get the eyeballs. It's not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to understand what coming back really looks like. I think it's going to be a new normal. I know that's trite, but a lot of studios, Netflix included, and I think all the legacy studios are trying to find what is the right equilibrium.
Yes.
And part of the reason is that the fundamental economics have sort of changed. Streaming can be profitable for some folks, but not for all folks. It can be hard to eke out a profit. Netflix has certainly achieved a healthy amount of profitability, but some of the legacy businesses that have started streamers are still working on that. And I think in terms of box office profitability, at best it's hit or miss. I think young people are still going to movies. I don't know if older folks have really come back since the pandemic. So it's kind of a crapshoot right now. And I think studios have to figure out what is my yearly strategy? How many movies should I put out per year in order to be profitable, considering that I no longer have this sort of home video revenue to rely on, and there's more pressure on the box office to be profitable. If there's more pressure on the box office to be profitable, then the cost of making those films comes under high scrutiny. And so films that may have been greenlit at numbers even 6 months ago or 8 months ago are not going to be greenlit at those numbers today. And that changes the dynamics of what's going to get made. And I think we're working through that pain now at every studio. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of studios where you still have agents and agencies bringing these packages to studios that look a lot like things from last year, but I don't think those things can get made anymore at the numbers that they're expecting. So all the studios are trying to figure out, how do we make those for less? Or what kinds of movies can we make?
Got you.
And I think there's a little bit of soul searching at every studio right now about that, especially around visual effects, which is on a given budget for a film, it's hundreds of pages long.
Yep.
And there's lots and lots of accounts, art department, Grip Electric, all kinds of things. And visual effects tends to be only a few pages long and a giant portion of a tentpole film. So it becomes an easy target to say, well, look how much money we're spending on visual effects. Why are we spending all this money on visual effects, and how can we do better? If you could just make a 10% cut there, you can actually move the needle on the movie, right? So that's where the thinking comes from, I think, in a lot of studios, of going after the visual effects budgets first. And I think that we're going to see a lot of downward pressure on visual effects budgets going forward.
Interesting. And I mean, I don't know if that's going to maybe coincide with, while these strikes have been happening globally, there seems to be sort of different tax breaks that are being sort of brought out globally right now. The UK have just been given a nice upgrade for them, so to speak. How do you see that moving forward in a visual effects capacity? Is visual effects going to keep getting spread around? Is there room for visual effects still in LA? Where do you see things going there?
I think the genie's out of the bottle on visual effects being a worldwide industry. I think that visual effects, we now know that the barriers to entry for talent and for technology mean that you can sort of do it from anywhere. We know that.
Yep.
The incentives that exist, the government incentives exist to foster industries beyond just visual effects, a lot of the incentives are because they want to have a bigger entertainment industry. It has really worked in London. It's really worked in the UK. I think that industry is robust, and you now have sort of a deep talent pool built up. I think for many years it worked really well in Atlanta, in Georgia.
Yeah.
I think as you've seen, Montreal recently pulled back on its incentive. I think that will have a detrimental effect on the visual effects industry in Montreal. I think visual effects vendors will reduce capacity available in Montreal. I think Australia has a really robust credit right now, and a lot of folks want to put work into Australia. I mean, at the studio level and the producer level.
Yep.
And I look at a credit like New Jersey's, which is really aggressive and new and may take advantage of sort of the New York market. Maybe some of the New York visual effects companies can expand into New Jersey to take advantage of that credit. So incentives play a huge role. I think the problem is when we lead with incentives, which a lot of producers do. So they come in and they sort of want the best coupon rate. They want to know that I'm getting 40% off or I'm getting 35% off, and they lead with that. I think that's a mistake. I think what we should be trying to do is find the best place to execute the visual effects with the best talent for the best price. Now, that may mean leveraging an incentive in a certain location, or it may just mean that a company in Los Angeles has to meet the same net price that the company with the incentive is doing.
Yeah.
That's extremely difficult because the labor costs are higher here.
Yeah.
But what I think that opens an opportunity is visual effects companies, particularly if you're going to be in Los Angeles, if you're going to be in California today, is you're going to have to be, I think, resilient. I think you're going to have to be adaptable. And I think you're going to have to find ways to be extremely efficient and perform some high-end services with a minimal amount of labor. And that might mean leveraging technology like, some of the developments around artificial intelligence and machine learning in your pipelines, or starting pipelines from scratch that aren't encumbered by sort of old legacy stuff, and finding new ways to do things. Because I think unless you can get your labor costs down, it's going to be extremely hard for visual effects companies in Los Angeles to be competitive on a bottom line with some of these other places with the incentives.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I think really awesome to hear from an individual on a studio side that, it's looking at things not just from that tax incentive point of view.
Yeah, I think people fall in love with the tax incentive rates. It's like, look how much I'm getting back. And like I said, I think that's a mistake. I think what they really mean is they want to get the most bang for their buck.
Yeah.
And they see the incentives as a leading way to do it. I prefer to try to find a company that's willing to work with us. By the way, you might still bid a company with that incentive on it, and then that's a net price, right?
Sure.
And then you bid another company that doesn't have the incentive, and you just say, like, you're going to have to hit in this range of net price in order to be competitive. And then it's kind of on the company to figure out if they can do it or not. It's not my job to determine their economics, but I give them a sort of guideline of where I think they're going to have to fall to be able to be reasonably competitive. But I do think there's an opportunity look, this is still a city of major innovation with a lot of talent. And I think if anyone can innovate, it can be the LA visual effects market. And when I first started in visual effects, we had a lot more Los Angeles-based visual effects companies. They were smaller, but they were dynamic, and they were able to achieve a lot of different kinds of visual effects with sort of small boutique-y mentalities.
Sure.
And I think that over the past decade or so, we've had a lot of consolidation with some big visual effects companies getting a lot of the market share by either acquiring other people or just kind of buying it in the marketplace. And I like people at all of these major companies. It's not a knock on the giant visual effects companies. I mean, they're amazing and they do things that no one else can do.
Sure.
But they're also, over the last year, shrinking. They're shedding some folks. It's hard to expand, or it's hard to maintain your workforce if there's no work. So I think if you're an artist in LA, you need to skill up, upskill. You need to make sure that you're thinking about how you can deliver really high-end looking visual effects of a diversified kind of visual effects with as minimal labor costs as possible. And I think there's technology becoming available to do that in an entrepreneurial way.
Yes.
And that will allow you to not worry so much about like where the latest incentive is, but you'll be able to find a way to be competitive with those bottom line prices. That's
awesome. And again, I think a really positive way to look at what's happening right now. I guess, it's nice to hear that chain of thought around, solutions, not only problems. and that happens globally, right? There's different issues everywhere. So for there to be a thought process around, and like you said, it might be tricky, but a thought process around how LA can keep some of their talent and not have them sort of move out and keep their homes here.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ideal, right? Because people are established here. I think we also have to understand and embrace that there's a level of change.
Yeah.
I mean, film production, and certainly when I first moved here, there were a lot more middle class, upper middle class jobs in film production where you didn't have to leave town. And now it's almost impossible.
Yes.
So, you're going on location no matter what for a certain period of time if you're in production.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that visual effects typically doesn't go on location, but it's a similar situation. Like I said, there used to be a lot of good, solid middle class jobs in visual effects in town. And I don't think there's going to be enough of a system to support as many as there once were. I just don't think we can sort of look at the tax incentive structures around the world and cry about it.
Sure.
I think they exist, and I think they're going to continue to exist. As you've seen with Montreal, sometimes a new government will come in and re-examine it. But as you've also seen with London, a new government will come in and double down.
Yes.
So we just have to realize that that's part of our business now. By the way, a lot of industries have to deal with, competing with labor markets in multiple countries.
Yeah.
Visual effects is the same now. And that's just the way it is. So what we have to do is in the face of that, you have to find out how can you compete on quality for a similar price.
Yes.
And that will bring in some level of convenience. Because if I don't have to necessarily outsource it 10,000 miles away to another time zone, if I can get it done down the street, that may provide benefits for me. So I think that's another way to look at it.
It makes sense. I mean, probably transitions quite nicely into the next question. You mentioned two words that's got a variable rep at the moment, sometimes scary, sometimes innovative. Artificial intelligence and that being introduced into the visual effects space. I mean, how are you sort of having conversations around that, and what's your feelings towards it first of all, and how can you maybe see it? Let's go positive. Let's see benefiting the industry.
Well, look, I think similar to tax incentives, there's no way artificial intelligence doesn't change the way we do visual effects.
Mm-hmm.
So to be in denial about it, or to sort of argue about what role it should play, I think is important. To argue about the ethics is important. But to say that there's a way that you could just sort of stop it from being involved in the means of production is a fantasy. It's here to stay. It's only going to get stronger, and it's going to do more things. So, but there's a difference, I think, between, regular old machine learning, artificial intelligence, I can't believe we have to call it regular old these days, and then generative AI, And I think the thing that people most fear is the implications of generative AI, because they feel like it's making art, it's replacing artists. So I'll say a couple things about both. I think if you're a visual effects company today and you're not looking at how to implement machine learning or artificial intelligence into your pipeline in some ways, then you're probably not going to make it, because that's going to be the way going forward. Is that visual effects companies are going to compete on efficiency, like I said, reduction in labor, and that means that certain disciplines, like if you're like I hate to say it, but if you're a roto artist in LA, like you are going to be innovated out of a job, like you're going to be automated right out of a job. So your job is to either upskill and learn a new discipline of visual effects, or to figure something out. Because that's where the AI and the machine learning is going to come first. It's going to come for tasks that can essentially be, and we can argue about whether or not rotoscoping can be automated, but it can be automated to some degree, and I think we also acknowledge that. They will be finessed, but we're going to get a lot of the sort of brute force labor out of it with these machine learning techniques. So that's the one thing. Generative AI is interesting because I think these are, generative AI is output from a model that's been trained on a certain amount of data. We'll just say that so that for folks who don't already know that, that's what it is. So essentially, it's a computer that's learned a lot of stuff by looking at a lot of stuff. And I think we can argue about whether or not it looked at someone's stuff and is now synthesizing a new thing. Did that person ever give permission for their stuff to be looked at? Probably not. I think there are ways to address that. I think there are ways that we will work out as an industry of how those people get royalties. So if you're, if you know your large language model was trained on a certain artist data, or they can, sort of prove it, then they should get paid something.
Sure.
I think it's, it's not entirely unlike when Napster came out and sort of distributed free music to everyone, and the music industry had to go through a radical rethink and then monetize streaming so that artists could get royalties. I think it's going to be somewhat similar to that. It's not exactly, because those artists still retain their copyright. There's a little messiness around copyright with these large language models. But what we can't deny is that there are going to be times where, for very simply, you can take a set extension or a matte painting and tell the generative AI to extend it or fill it in.
Yeah.
And it will do it. It's going to look at what you're providing as an input, which in this case might be a piece of art generated by an artist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to use that to extrapolate and make a new thing based on the input it just got. That's like a power tool for an artist. I think the positive part that artists should see is that this is going to enable them to generate more work than they could before. Where I see it really making a huge difference already is in things like concept art.
Sure.
So concept artists are able to produce. Now look, the concept art process is usually a process of things you don't like, and you have to spend a lot of time generating versions of things that never see the light of day, but at least allow the director or the art director, the production designer to say, well, I know I don't like that. Or maybe I just like this claw and this wing from these two things. Now put them in a third thing, right?
Yeah.
And that could be a week of work for a concept artist, but with generative AI, that could be minutes. So I think that we'll be finding a way to compress that sort of R&D phase, that development phase, that visual development phase with generative AI. And that's how we should be looking at it, I think, as artists, is how it can help us be more powerful and accomplish more.
Yeah.
Faster, because that will allow, I think, films to be better prepped. A lot of times these big visual effects movies that have creatures or locations, they go into production without designs locked. I hate to say it.
Yeah.
And part of it is just because the process of designing those things and locking them just takes a long time. So if generative AI can speed that up, then that's a win, I think, for everybody.
Interesting. Fascinating to hear.
Now, what that's not, let me go tell the generative AI to give me something completely original, right?
Yes.
That's an artist working with generative AI, giving it something and saying, now give me some variations on this, or take the claw from this and the wing from this, and also synthesize a few other bits and bobs. And then they still will have to finesse that or paint over it. Like, you'll still need an artist's skill to manipulate the output of these models. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind.
Interesting. Just listening to that is fascinating. And I think a lot of people listening in from the artist side can take a lot from that. Just thinking on those things, could you see previs becoming more popular with AI? And because sometimes you kind of hear how previs can start and then just completely get cut.
Yeah.
Can you see this becoming a bigger part of the industry potentially with?
So previs is really interesting because I think from a lot of people feel that previs it's a very expensive cartoon.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times a lot of money gets spent making previs, and then you get on the day to go shoot it and the director sort of just goes, oh, that's nice, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to do this other thing. So great, cool. You basically made a cartoon. Absolutely. Already you have companies like Wonder Dynamics, right? That have achieved, using some generative AI techniques in post-viz. Again, doesn't replace any artists. There's still a traditional post-viz process around that. What it is doing is a lot of the brute force work of take the guy, I call them the guys in pajamas, the people who are wearing all the tracking markers. I always call them guys in pajamas, but take the guy in pajamas, replace him with a creature or robot or whatever, and there's your rough first pass of post-viz. Now, for the previs side, absolutely. Like, if you can take a set of storyboards that you've agreed upon with the director and then sort of start to input those into something generative to give you a very rough layout of previs, which again then can be finessed in something like Unreal, then I think that's going to be heavily leveraged in the prep process. I think a lot of movies that looked at previs and said, gee, this is just an expensive cartoon, are probably going to have another look at it because we can do it more efficiently, and we will soon be able to do it a lot more efficiently if we leverage some of these generative tools. I know I'll probably get a lot of flack for talking up these generative tools for artists, but I really do think that I wouldn't approach them from a place of total fear.
Yeah.
I think they should do their own research and, mess around with a couple of tools with some really low risk art that you make, whether it's just things that you want to sketch and feed to the beast and see what it can do. Say, make this photo realistic, or take this and turn it into an animated 1 second video for me, or a few second video for me. I think people should experiment and see whether it can benefit them or not.
Yeah. No, for sure. But I think again, listening to that, there's elements of opportunity here. Let's go back to the roto thing that you mentioned, and okay, that could remove roto from an artist perspective. However, what there's always been in visual effects is either too much content, not enough artists, too many artists, not enough content. And I've mentioned this countless times across the podcast and on LinkedIn. Maybe I'm living in this fairy tale world where we actually get to a happy medium where there's enough of both. So could this actually potentially push that on? Roto is potentially replaced, but one thing that's for sure in this industry, we always need more comp.
Yeah.
and good comp. So
animation. I mean, animation is a real, skill that is a craft that takes years to hone, and, is not going anywhere, I agree. I think that if you got into visual effects, you probably have an artistic bent, highly technical bent, and I think you should lean on that to find, to move around in some of these disciplines. I do think we're also only talking really about, I'm a film guy, right? So, I mean, almost my entire career, I've worked on film, on movies and features. So where I think we also have to think about is, what are the sort of tangential types of content that are going to leverage a visual effects workflow going forward? And I think that includes video games, which already do, but it also includes all the content that's going to come for what I think is called sometimes XR, this AR, VR stuff.
Yeah.
As well as theme park attractions, live events. There's going to be a lot of demand for what looks like visual effects processes. And so the more that artists can learn to become multidisciplinary across the visual effects spectrum by leveraging some of these tools and technology, then I think you might be right. We might find a sweet spot where, hey, you might not only work on films anymore as a visual effects artist. You might have to sort of think about where are the other places that are paying.
Sure.
But you still be able to use your trade, and you might be able to do more than just sort of roto or, basic A/B comping.
No, that's, again, really valid point, and a great point, actually. And, artists having that potential ability to sort of switch things up and work on things that they might not have been able to because they were pigeonholed into a certain category. I mean, again, I love the big visual effects companies, but there's some degree of, you rise through seniority, and you have to do your sort of number of years of service. And the film industry, by the way, is like this in lots of places. But, that's your apprenticeship, and then you move up. But I think some of those initial roles are going to become automated. So, you'll do your apprenticeship in a different discipline, or you can go now with the tools available to you, you become a lot more powerful on your own. And I think that's the opportunity for entrepreneurial artists to think, how can I become a more well-rounded visual effects artist, and be able to position myself to provide services to a number of industries besides just film, knowing that film in particular is going through a place where all the major studios are trying to find an equilibrium of how much product they actually want to make per year. Makes sense. I mean, I'm going to switch it up a little bit. In terms of yourself, film guy, been in the industry for a strong amount of time now, seen things change. As you mentioned, you've been a part of 2 strikes. But for someone who loves film, where would you like to see things going over the next 5-10 years? It's putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to see us figure out how to draw people back to theaters.
Uh-huh.
I'd like to see packed theaters again. Um, I don't know if that's possible. I know it's possible in a lot of other markets. I don't know what's possible in the US anymore. But as a kid, I remember we had these things called newspapers. I don't know if anybody remembers those, but what we would do is on a rainy day, you would open up the newspaper and you would see what was playing, and all the show times would be listed, for all the movies and local theaters.
Yeah.
And there were a number of local theaters because there was demand. Nowadays, it's only multiplexes, and you would be able to just kind of go and see a movie, and they'd be packed. And I think it was the thing to do. I think these days we have so much available entertainment to us at home, sitting on our couch,
Yeah.
and we've achieved a level of spectacle with home entertainment, with streaming series and video games, that movies don't feel special on a spectacle level. I was just talking to someone about this, where I don't think audiences are especially wowed by visual effects on a big screen anymore. I think you have the occasional Avatar, but for the most part, I don't think people are going because they're seeing something that's really cool in CG, because I feel like we've kind of seen it.
Yeah. Okay.
What they're going for is new and interesting and clever stories, and some of those involve CG and some of them don't.
Yeah.
But what I'd really like to see, I know I didn't really answer your question about where I see it going, but where I'd like to see it going is that I'd like to see more movies and more really interesting stories that compel people back to theaters that they don't want to wait for.
Yeah.
I think Dune was a good example of this. I mean, a lot of people wanted to see that in a theater. There was something about that experience that was cinematic for people. So I think if studios can concentrate on making cinematic content that has to be seen in a theater, that would be great. Now, for the streamers who don't want to put movies in theaters and they only want to put movies on their screens, then it still becomes about compelling stories that that people will want to click on.
Yeah.
So 10 years, who knows? I mean, 10 years, we might have so many different ways of consuming entertainment. I do think that at the end of the day, there will be such a technological shift in how we make these things that so many more people will be able to make what looks like photorealistic content very easily. So in a world where everything looks photoreal and we can no longer differentiate on, who's spending the most money to do that, because everyone's doing that.
Sure.
Then I just think it's going to be, and again, it might be trite, but I think the best stories are going to win. So I think storytelling is still going to be paramount to what makes people want to pay money to go to a theater, click on a thing on their screen, watch a thing in their headset, whatever it is. I think storytelling is still going to be king.
Love that. Absolutely love that. Would really enjoy to have that feeling back. I mean, I love watching old school movies purely for that. Feeling that love. So yeah, I think that'd be epic to see. Now, look, we're kind of going to wrap this up soon, but before we do, I ask this question to every single guest for a number of reasons. Mainly to kind of try and link to the people that are listening in, some nostalgia, kind of remind them why they've come into the industry. Can you give me one peak within your career so far that's kind of really brought a smile to your face? You can name a few if you want.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think for me, sure. I mean, I think for me, working on the Jurassic World franchise at Universal was a dream come true. I remember reading Jurassic Park and then seeing the movie. And of course, I was already a big time film fan at that point, and especially a Spielberg fan. But I remember seeing the original Jurassic Park and being completely blown away. I will watch that movie today with the sound off. Just to watch. I absolutely love every frame of that film. So getting to work on the sort of reboot of the franchise was a real treat. And I think Jurassic World Dominion, we had some really giant animatronic stuff, and being able to work on the set of a film, even though I was at the studio, being able to kind of be on the set of a film where I could see us employing these giant animatronics and then enhancing them with CG in that sort of old school way was phenomenal. I was like a kid in a candy store. They have these dinosaurs with guys in these little bike, and they're sort of like riding the bike, and it's puppeting the dinosaur above them, and it's just incredible to see in real life because that thing's on camera. It's in the movie, and then other times we're, as visual effects, really helping to enhance those or bring them home, and that's where you feel the real handoff between the physical and the digital, and that's the exciting thing for me about visual effects is still how we do what we do to help them do what they do and make the best film possible.
I think that is an awesome way to finish this episode, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on. I think it's been super informative. Definitely a lot to think about, to take in, and evidently there's ways to move forward in a positive manner. So thanks again. Really appreciate that.
Well, hey, listen, thanks for having me, and welcome to Los Angeles.
Love it. Can't wait to see you again soon.